Moving over to the wide receiver spot, the top start is Odell Beckham Jr. for the Cleveland Browns. Now Beckham, he has certainly been up and down in Cleveland. I think this is a great week for a big game from Odell Beckham.
Love is so evil. Love is at its base.
Will you follow me when the sky starts to change? Yeah, we won't be afraid. We'll never be the same again.
You're streaming with the Fantasy Follow. Welcome to TFF Live Sunday Pregame. Again, this week, we start the same way as we did last week, as the NFL experiencing more issues with the COVID-19 pandemic. 2 games scheduled for today, postponed. The first of which, Denver at New England, originally was scheduled for a Monday night game this week in the 5 o'clock slot on ESPN. That game has been postponed. New England has been asked to shut down their facility after another positive test today. Buffalo at Tennessee, originally scheduled to be played today, is still scheduled as of now for Tuesday, 7 Eastern Time, national game on CBS. However, Tennessee did have another positive test this morning, a staff member. Yet to be determined what's going to happen with this game. But as of right now, still a lot of things up in the air. So we certainly know it's going to be a difficult run to get all these games in. We certainly hope that the scheduling is able to be worked out as best as possible. And of course, we hope that the health and well-being for everybody involved. It's a tough run here. We knew it was going to be like this. But as we transition back into fantasy football, let's talk about some of the things we've got on today's show. We're going to take a look back at week 4. We're going to get you some player updates from around the league. We will get you the actives and inactives for the 1 p.m. games, and we will take a look at our start sits for week 5. We start out today with the news that went down earlier this week as Bill O'Brien became the first coach to lose his job this season when the Houston Texans fired him after the team started the season 0-4. Now, O'Brien had some success in his tenure with Houston. He was 52-48 over his 7 seasons and was now not only serving as head coach, but also as general manager. The much talked about trade of star receiver DeAndre Hopkins was no doubt factor in this decision, as the team certainly has not gotten off the start they would like this season. Now, earlier this week, O'Brien and also new interim head coach Romeo Crennel met with the media.
Number one, I really want to thank the McNair family. Cal, Janice, Hannah, obviously the late Bob McNair for just giving me and my family this opportunity. They were always very supportive, and in the end, in this business, it's a bottom line business. We weren't able to get it to where we needed to get it, and I obviously have tremendous respect for their family, and again, I thank them for the opportunity that they gave me. I understand we fell short in terms of taking this team further in the playoffs, but I do leave knowing that myself and this staff gave everything this organization deserved and more. We worked very, very hard to try to get this to a place where it could be a championship program. We just didn't get it done. I will leave here with very fond memories of the Houston Texans organization, very fond memories of Houston. When my family and I came here in 2014, we had no idea what to expect. Houston is a great city. You think about Texas Children's Hospital and what it's done for my family, my son Jack. We can't thank Texas Children's Hospital enough. My son Michael's had a tremendous experience here living in Westview, and the friends that we've made here in Houston are lifelong friends, and we really appreciate their friendship. Most importantly to the players, I talked to the players briefly this afternoon and just thanked them. I told them I love them. I think these players are just awesome guys. They practiced hard. They tried to do everything we asked them to do. It was a pleasure coaching them. I'm going to miss seeing them every day. Just really the guys that have been with me for 7 years to the guys that were only here for a year. Every one of them just tremendous guys. And I'm just sorry we couldn't get it done this year early on here. But I wish them the best. This is a good football team. Romeo stepped in. He's an awesome coach, and he'll do a great job.
Well, Coach O'Brien, he was the reason that I'm here to start with, so I appreciate that. And over the years here, we've done some good things, AFC championships and all of those South championships. But we know that it's a production business. And you have to produce, and we were not off to a good start this year, and the expectations were so much greater than what we've shown on the field. And so as a result of that, ownership decided to make the change.
The fantasy prospects in Houston, well, it remains to be seen what happens with the shakeup there. Offensive coordinator Tim Kelly will take over play calling duties. And as you take a look at the top 4 players in terms of fantasy rankings in the Houston team, Deshaun Watson certainly at QB 13 is lower than you would have wanted him after drafting him. David Johnson, I thought, was going to be a good player this year. He has yet to really break through. We've seen some bright spots from Will Fuller. If he can stay healthy, he certainly has the potential. Randall Cobb at wide receiver 46 is next in line, and Brandon Cooks has been next to non-existent. You have to think better days are ahead. Certainly the start of their schedule was very rough. In the very least, I would expect Watson to turn it up, and we'll kind of see who else comes along with him. Some quarterback news this week as 2 new starters were named. Justin Herbert, who effectively has been starting for the Chargers, he took over the job kind of unexpectedly in week 2 after kind of a freak injury to Tyrod Taylor that was suffered while he was receiving treatment. And Herbert got the last-minute start there in a loss to Kansas City. He's played well since, and this week Anthony Lynn named him starter for the rest of the season. Now, Herbert had a 3-touchdown performance last week against Tom Brady in a loss to Tampa Bay. And really the fantasy impact here, I think Keenan Allen is a big benefactor. He's seen 28 targets in the last 3 games with Herbert under center. And I definitely also think that Herbert has streaming value of his own, including this week in a nice matchup with New Orleans. They're giving up the 7th most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. But after that, they play the Jets, Miami, Jacksonville. While the Jets number is only 24, I mean, they're the Jets. Miami giving up the 5th most and Jacksonville the 13th most. So a nice little run and some potential streaming value for Justin Herbert. Earlier on in the week, Anthony Lynn, he talked about what impressed him most about the rookie quarterback.
I think he's shown the consistency that you look for, especially in a rookie quarterback. And he made some pretty nice throws too. Now, he made some hell of plays. So I think this young man is just going to continually get better. And I know we can win with him. I believe that. We haven't done it yet, but I do believe those wins are coming. I'm only saying this right now because Justin is going to start Monday night in New Orleans, and Justin's going to be our starting quarterback. And I did not take that decision lightly because Tyrod Taylor is a veteran quarterback with a winning record in this league, which is very hard to do. And he's one of the best in the game in taking care of the football. I thought it would have been ideal for us to play this year with Tyrod Taylor as a starter and Justin to watch and learn, similar to what Patrick Mahomes did in Kansas City. But it didn't work out that way. He got thrown in the fire, and I thought he handled the situation well, and I want to see more of him. And it's not going to be a situation where he's looking over his shoulder. He's our starting quarterback. He make a bad play. He has a bad game. He's our quarterback.
In Washington, it will no longer be Dwayne Haskins under center, as Coach Ron Rivera has elected to give Kyle Allen the start. Now, the second-year quarterback has struggled, and the move to Allen does give head coach Rivera a quarterback who is more familiar with their system, as Allen started the majority of the season last year for Rivera in Carolina, while Cam Newton was out with injury. It was mixed success for Allen, but when you look at the fantasy impact here, one of the interesting notes that I thought was the usage of Antonio Gibson as their running back there in Washington. Now, clearly the Carolina system fed Christian McCaffrey, but even more so, when Kyle Allen was there in his last 6 games played for Carolina, he delivered 68 targets to McCaffrey, 11.3 average per game. And it's kind of obvious that they would like to see Gibson used in a similar way. Now, granted, nobody is Christian McCaffrey, but if you have Antonio Gibson on your roster, you have the potential to really have some nice benefit here from the switch in quarterbacks. Now, Rivera, earlier in the week, he talked about his reasons for making this decision at this time.
Well, I think the biggest thing is looking at where we are in terms of our schedule and the situation and circumstances. This has been thought out by me for a while, to me it goes back to the beginning of the schedule. We have 4 games coming up at the beginning that I was hoping to come out of it being 2-4, and then going into a stretch where we play 4 NFC games, 3 divisional games, and again where we could make some hay. And unfortunately, we're 1-3. We got 4 divisional games coming up. 3 divisional games coming up, 4 conference games. And I just felt, based on the things that have gone on with Dwayne, based on his development and where he is, we're better off putting the ball in the hands of guys that know our system, a guy that's been in our system for 3 years, backed up by a guy that's been in the system before and is a little bit more accomplished quarterback.
The fantasy. Taking a look back at some of the action in week 4 and a couple of big injuries last week. LA Chargers losing Austin Eckler to what did not look good. And bad news if you have Austin Eckler on a lot of rosters in your leagues. Now, he was reported to have a grade 2 hamstring strain. Expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks after getting injured in that loss to Tampa Bay. And you would expect a split now in the backfield there between Joshua Kelly and Justin Jackson. I don't know if Eckler and Kelly were already splitting. I don't know why they would give the entire backfield to Kelly at this point. I would think that they would bring in Jackson. Neither one of them were all that effective in last week's game. So it kind of remains to be seen, what it looks like there after Eckler's gone while he's out. And Nick Chubb exited last week's game against Dallas with an MCL injury. He is expected to miss 6 weeks, so not good for Chubb. In the backfield there, obviously you have Kareem Hunt, and we saw Dearness Johnson come in and take a lot of the work last week. Johnson, 95 yards on 13 carries. Hunt had 71 yards last week and 2 touchdowns. Remains to be seen exactly how this backfield looks with Chubb out. I know there's a lot of expectations for Hunt here. I am a little bit cautious, and I will talk a little bit more about that in this week's Start and Sit. Taking a look back at some of the top performances last week in our Week 4 recap, starting with the quarterbacks. It was Dak Prescott continuing his hot play. It was a loss to the Cleveland Browns, but fantasy-wise, 38.28 points, 502 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, even threw in 12 rushing yards. It was Tom Brady cracking the top 5 in a win against the Chargers, 33.46 fantasy points. That was 369 yards passing and 5 touchdowns. Continued solid play from Aaron Rodgers in a win versus Atlanta, 29.58 fantasy points, 327 yards passing, even without Devontae Adams, 4 touchdowns. It seems like all of them went to Robert Tonyan, and he even threw in 5 rushing yards. Teddy Bridgewater in a win for Carolina versus Arizona, 27.24 fantasy points, That was 276 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, and 1 touchdown on the ground with 32 rushing yards. And Lamar Jackson makes the list in a win over Washington, 26.02 fantasy points. That was on 193 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, an additional 53 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground. For the wide receivers, it was Odell Beckham Jr. with a big game against the Cowboys. Seems like everybody has big games against the Cowboys this season. 38.40 fantasy points. He did it rushing and passing. 81 yards through the air, 5 catches and 2 touchdowns, an additional 73 rush yards and a touchdown on the ground. Amari Cooper in the loss, 33.40 fantasy points. He had 134 yards receiving, 12 catches, and a touchdown. DJ Chark makes the list in a loss to the Bengals, 29.50 fantasy points. He had 95 yards receiving, 8 catches, and 2 touchdowns. Number 4 was Adam Thielen in a win over Houston, 26.20 fantasy points. That was 114 yards, 8 catches, and 1 touchdown. And then a tie in the 5th spot, it was CD Lamb and Mike Evans, both with 25.20 fantasy points. Lamb, 79 yards, 5 catches, 2 touchdowns. And it was Evans with 122 yards, 7 catches, and 1 score. For the running backs, well, Joe Mixon, big day, the number 1 scorer of all players last week in a win over Jacksonville, 42.10 fantasy points. That was 151 yards rushing with 2 touchdowns, adding another 30 yards through the air, 6 catches, and a touchdown there as well. Dalvin Cook in second in a win over Houston, 28.60 fantasy points. That was 130 yards rushing with 2 touchdowns, another 16 yards receiving on 2 catches. Melvin Gordon from the Thursday night game against the Jets, 25.80 fantasy points on 107 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns, 11 receiving yards with 2 catches. Chris Carson in a win for the Seahawks against Miami, 25.00 fantasy points. That was 80 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns, another 20 through the air with 3 catches. And Antonio Gibson in a loss to the Ravens, 22.80 fantasy points, 46 yards rushing with a touchdown, and receiving for 82 yards and 4 catches. A nice game for Antonio Gibson. And for the tight ends, well, welcome back, George Kittle. 40.10 fantasy points versus the Eagles. That was on a huge 183 yards receiving with 1 touchdown, 15 catches. Amazing game for George Kittle. And how about new tight end superstar Robert Tonyan in Green Bay? 33.80 fantasy points against Atlanta, 98 yards, 3 touchdowns on 6 catches. Mark Andrews back in the top 5 against Washington, 20.70 fantasy points, 57 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 catches. It was Dalton Schultz against the Browns, 17.20 fantasy points, 72 yards and a touchdown, 4 catches. And Darren Waller versus the Bills, 15.80 fantasy points. That was on 88 yards receiving, over 9 catches. All right, let's take you around the league for some player updates for Week 5. Today, we're going to get started out in Baltimore.
What happened was, the Wednesday, his knee just didn't feel, just felt sore, and he just felt like he needed to try to rest it a little bit between him and Coach Roman and Urban and Ron Medlin, our trainer, just felt like that was the best course. So that was what happened Wednesday. Then Thursday, he was ready to go, but he got sick. Yeah, stomach was really bothering him, so he had to go home. He just I don't know if he ate something bad or what it was, but He gets, we all get something like that periodically. So that's what that was. So it was just a kind of a strange timing on that whole deal, but that's what happened. So he's good to go.
AJ continues to get treatment, and then we'll be able to identify him and see where he's at today and tomorrow.
How are you doing? How did it feel getting back to practice, and what kind of complications, what kind of things do you have to work through to be successful on Sunday?
Nothing crazy. I mean, it's just ankle's feeling really good right now. Got the last couple of weeks off to get it right. And so the training staff, I tip my hat to those guys. They did a great job with me, just preparing me and everything. But as far as getting out there, I mean, we've had the whole week to work on it, so it's feeling pretty good right now.
Coach, obviously losing a player of Nick's quality would be devastating to some teams, but you guys have the perfect next man up, if you will, in Kareem. How confident are you that he's going to be able to just be as productive as he's been, and that you guys will not have a fall off?
I mean, I'm confident in our entire running back room, Tom. I fully understand the caliber of player that Nick is, and we'd love to have Nick out there, but in the meantime, he's going to be hanging out with Joe Sheehan and the training staff and getting ready to get back out there. So in the meantime, I really think we have guys that understand the scheme, guys that can contribute in the run and the pass. I'm really excited for those guys. I think they're well coached. I think Stump's excited for the challenge of these guys. So we'll have to make do until Nick gets back there.
Coming up next, we're going to take a look at the actives and inactives for the 1 p.m. games. The lists are out. But before we do that, we want to remind you and thank you for watching the TFF Live Sunday Pregame Show. We're here every week at 12 noon, streaming live right here on our YouTube channel, taking you right up until game time, getting you ready for your fantasy matchups each week. All right, let's get into some of the actives and inactives so far. We've got a good slate of games coming up, 7 games in the early window. We've got another 3 at the 4 o'clock window, and then, of course, the night games tonight, tomorrow night. So let's go ahead and take a look and see who's in your lineup and who you need to make sure to get out of there before the games start today. And we will start in Atlanta, where Carolina is visiting to take on the Falcons. Atlanta looking for their first win. A couple of notable players here that have been dealing with injuries. Calvin Ridley is active today. Julio Jones is inactive. I think this is a wise move after Julio tried to play last week and just re-aggravated. I don't think this is a good situation for him to keep trying to push it. We saw what happened similar with Adam Thielen last year with a hamstring injury. I think it's a smart move for the Falcons to sit Julio down, see what happens right now. It's obviously a tough spot being 0-4, but long-term, probably much better off and much more in their interest to do so. In Kansas City today, a lot of names on the list here, most of them active, so that is good news. You got the Raiders taking on the Chiefs. Chiefs at 4-0. Actives, Josh Jacobs, Henry Ruggs, Darren Waller, all for the Raiders. Ruggs was the only one that was questionable out of those 3. Jacobs and Waller were on the injury report, but they were not questionable going in, so you should be able to fire them up today. Tyreek Hill and Mecole Hardman, they also were not questionable, but they were on the injury report, so we've added them here as active. And not playing again this week, the rookie Bryan Edwards, wide receiver for the Raiders. All right, moving over to the next game is Arizona at the Jets. Le'Veon Bell has been activated off of IR. Chris Hogan is active. Jamison Crowder is active. Not playing Sam Darnold. Joe Flacco will get the start for the Jets. And wide receiver Brashad Perriman also not playing. Nothing to speak of on the Arizona side of things here. Boy, this is another Jets game. I've been pretty mean to the Jets this year, but come on, let's show something out there here. Philadelphia playing at Pittsburgh. We've got active for the Eagles, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, but inactive Deshaun Jackson and Alshon Jeffrey once again. Another depleted lineup for the Eagles. It's been a tough year for them, and now facing a tough Pittsburgh defense this week. Coming off a week off, this seems like a tough task for me. Deontay Johnson is active for the Steelers, as is Juju Smith-Schuster. Let's see what they come back with. Possibly a big game out of James Conner. I would expect Pittsburgh to be in control of this game. Don't know how much they will throw the ball. I know I have Deontay Johnson in one of my lineups today, so we will see what happens there. LA Rams at the Washington FT. Cam Akers is back active for the Rams, so that makes it a three-person backfield with Malcolm Brown and Darrell Henderson. Interesting to see what happens there. Dwayne Haskins now not only is not even the backup, but he is inactive. I guess that makes sense for today's game. Alex Smith is the backup and Kyle Allen the starter. We will talk a little bit more about Kyle Allen as we go and how that affects Antonio Gibson. Gibson, I think, is in line for some more work, or at least continued work in Washington. We'll also see how the change at quarterback might impact a couple of other players. Terry McLaurin, who has been having a fairly good year, and also Logan Thomas, who we kept talking about and just hasn't happened. But we'll see if that turns into anything there in Washington. Cincinnati at the Ravens. A bunch of names on the list questionable for Baltimore, but they are all playing. For the Bengals, Joe Mixon is active. John Ross is not. Joe Mixon coming off his big week last week. For the Ravens, you've got Lamar Jackson in your lineup. You got Marquise Brown available, and you got Mark Andrews in your lineup. The last game of the 1 o'clock slate, we've got Jacksonville taking on Houston. Is this a get-right game for Houston after letting go of Bill O'Brien? We will find out. Not a lot here on the lists for Jacksonville. D.D. Westbrook, I feel like at this point they are just trolling us by having them on the inactive list every week. I don't know what's going on there. And for Houston, tight end Jordan Akins is not available, as neither is Kiki Cootie. Taking a look at the later slate of games, starting with the 4:05 start. It is the Dolphins at the 49ers. Questionable Jakeem Grant for the Dolphins. And for San Francisco, Raheem Mostert and Deebo Samuel. I have seen some reports expecting both of them to play, but obviously keep your eyes out to when they release their actives and inactives an hour and a half before that game. Obviously, if Mostert is playing, he's probably in your lineup, and that's definitely going to affect things for Jerick McKinnon. It'll likely be a Mostert-McKinnon split, I would think, in that case. We will see what happens there. Probably a really good game for the San Francisco run game, although Miami has been tougher than expected this year. At the 4:25 slide, I got Indianapolis at Cleveland. An interesting game, 2 3-1 teams. Nothing to speak of here on the questionables. Should be a pretty good game in Cleveland. See what happens there. A lot of interesting storylines. And Slightly less interesting is the Giants at the Cowboys, although for fantasy purposes, definitely interesting. One win between these two teams. Nothing to see here on the questionables. This is Dallas is bad defensively, and New York is bad offensively. So I don't know what's going to happen here, but you would expect Dak Prescott to continue to have a big day. Probably a nicer outlook for Ezekiel Elliott today. I can't imagine that the Giants really put up much of a test here, but you never know. Someone's got to win, right? So we'll find out. The NBC Sunday Night Football game, Minnesota at Seattle. This one, we expect a lot of points. A very good fantasy game, and you got it in the primetime slot. Questionable for the Seahawks is Carlos Hyde. KJ Osborne is out for Minnesota. More to talk about on this game in the starts and sits. And the Monday night game, the Chargers at the Saints. Also a lot of interesting storylines to look at here and things to be aware of. Questionable for the Chargers is Mike Williams. Tyrod Taylor is out. Of course, it's Justin Herbert getting the start. On the Saints side, of course, Michael Thomas is still the big story. Will he be able to work his way back into the lineup this week? Also, Jared Cook is questionable for that game. All right, that's all the games. Coming up next, we're going to give you our starts and sits. But before we do that, we want to remind you about all the ways you can find us. We are a brand new channel here on YouTube. We thank you for watching us. If you like our video, please give us a thumbs up and share. Please comment below with all of your fantasy insights. We want to know your thoughts. And please subscribe now. We have a new goal of 100 new subscribers by week 7. So please help us to reach that goal. Go ahead and click that subscribe button and get notified of all of our upcoming live shows and when our videos are released. Don't forget to get at us on Twitter at the Fantasy Follow, and that's fantasy spelled FNTSY. And you can send us your lineup questions during the week using the hashtag AskTFFLive, and we'll answer those questions live on this show. On Facebook, / the Fantasy Follow, and our website, thefantasyfollow.com. All right, we want to remind you that our live chat is open. You can ask us your lineup questions as we go here. We're going to go through our starts and sits, and we will get into some lineup questions after we go through those, so stay with us. Let's get on into the starts and sits. We're going to start at the quarterback spot this week. The top start is Drew Brees for the New Orleans Saints, playing at home in the Monday night game versus the LA Chargers. The Chargers giving up the 4th most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. There's been a lot of talk about Brees this year. Michael Thomas possibly back. Brees is averaging 2 touchdowns per game. Los Angeles has given up 27 or more fantasy points in 2 of their 4 games, and they gave up 5 touchdowns to Tom Brady last week. The 8th most passing yards allowed for the Chargers. I think there's a decent chance this is a high-scoring game, and certainly if Michael Thomas is available, you expect that they are going to feed him, and that brings Brees into play. I have him as the top quarterback start this week. And the rest of the top 5, No mistake. Justin Herbert, number 2 at the Saints. Like I said, I expect this to be a high-scoring game. Herbert has averaged just over 310 yards in his 3 games that he has started and 20.98 fantasy points. So a nice streaming option. I know that I have him streaming in one league to fill a bye. New Orleans giving up the 7th most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They have given up 21 or more fantasy points every game, and they have given up the 8th most passing yards allowed. Well, that seems hard to imagine, and I believe I may have miswritten that down in my notes because I can't imagine both that New Orleans and the Chargers are giving up the 8th most. But either way, we do know that they're both giving up fantasy numbers to the quarterback spot, so that makes Herbert a nice play. At number 3, this has to be a get-right game for Houston and Deshaun Watson. A lot of talk about what the Texans will do after the firing of Bill O'Brien, that they will come out on all cylinders this game, playing against Jacksonville, giving up the 13th most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They have given up 24 or more fantasy points in 2 out of 4 games. Last year, Watson, in his 2 games, it was 159 yards and 201 yards in the 2 games. 2 touchdowns in the second game only. We will see what he does today. I think this is a really nice spot for Watson. Like I said, the Texans have got to come out firing this game. Number 4, another nice streaming option is Teddy Bridgewater for Carolina, playing at Atlanta, who are only giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They have allowed 29 or more fantasy points in each of their 4 games and 4 touchdowns in 3 of their 4 games to the quarterback spot. Bridgewater, nice week last week versus Arizona, his best game of the year. Atlanta allowing the 2nd most passing yards in the league. Teddy Bridgewater, a nice streamer in week 5. At the 5 spot is Kirk Cousins for Minnesota, playing at Seattle. Seattle giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They have averaged 28.52 fantasy points allowed, and they have had 2 games where the quarterback has thrown for over 400 yards. Now, last year, Cousins against Seattle, 2 touchdowns and 276 yards, 18.04 fantasy points. So just a game. He's been this year, but the emergence of Justin Jefferson in the receiver core there makes a big difference. The dual threat now with him and Adam Thielen certainly means that there are some better days ahead for Kirk Cousins. Your top quarterback sit is Baker Mayfield for the Cleveland Browns. Baker playing against the Indianapolis Colts, who are allowing the fewest fantasy points to the quarterback spot. This is a very interesting game, and I said before that I would talk more about this game, and it won't be just about Baker Mayfield. The Colts allowing the 3rd fewest passing yards in the league. They have had 7 picks over the last 3 games, and they have held 3 of their 4 opposing quarterbacks to under 175 yards. Mayfield has had only 1 game over 200 yards. It was a nice game last week. Not huge numbers, but a nice win against the Cowboys. But this is a different week against a different team. Colts a little bit banged up on defense. Could make a difference, but nonetheless, I have Baker as the top quarterback sit. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, Derek Carr from the Raiders at the Chiefs. Chiefs allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They shut down New England last week. Lamar Jackson struggled against them. They've allowed the 3rd fewest passing yards in the league. Number 3, Ryan Fitzpatrick for the Dolphins at the 49ers. Anyone playing the 49ers, obviously, they are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback spot. They have allowed less than 12 fantasy points in 2 of 4 games this season. Fitzpatrick has averaged 24.11 fantasy points the last 3 games, but this is a tougher spot, and I have him on the sit list. At number 4, this was Nick Foles. Again, when we put out our starts and sits during the week, I do not change them for the live show. So if there happens to be a player in the Thursday night game, I leave them up there for better or for worse. Sometimes we have a nice pat on the back, and sometimes we can boo ourselves. But this week on the sit list was Nick Foles, and not all that great of a game. So at least we kind of earned our stripes a little bit there. And at number 5 is Kyle Allen getting the start for Washington versus the Rams. Matchup-wise, it's not a terrible matchup. They're 18th to the quarterback spot, so in the bottom half. They've given up under 15 points in 2 of 4 games. However, Aaron Donald and the Rams, I think, will be coming after him in his first game this season. We will see what he can do with Washington. The starts and sits at the wide receiver spot. The top start this week is Justin Jefferson for the Minnesota Vikings, playing at the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Seattle is giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. They've allowed 7 100 or more yard receivers this year and 7 wide receivers to score 20 or more fantasy points. They have given up the most passing yards in the league. Jefferson has broken 100 yards each of the last 2 games, and he is hot. I expect this to be a big game for Jefferson on a national stage for the rookie. So he is the top start this week. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, DK Metcalf playing in the same game versus the Vikings. Minnesota allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. They have allowed 3 100-yard receivers this year, the 4th most passing yards allowed in the league. Last year, Metcalf against the Vikings, 6 catches for 75 yards. But this year, he has had 92 or more yards all 4 games. I think this is another nice game for DK Metcalf. And obviously, with Russell Wilson throwing you the ball, you've got good chances there. Number 3 is Robbie Anderson for the Carolina Panthers at Atlanta. Atlanta giving up the 10th most fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. They have allowed 3 100 or more yard receivers this year and 5 receivers for 16 or more fantasy points. And they are allowing the 2nd most passing yards in the league. Anderson has seen 8 or more targets in 3 of 4 games and also 99 yards in 3 of 4 games. So I like Robbie Anderson today. And I believe we have a question here from Darren Hopkins, who is asking Robbie Anderson or Cooper Kupp. Well, I would have to say I would pick Anderson in this game. I think that with the Rams, they are liking the run-heavy offense. And today, playing against Washington, you would not expect them to have to throw the ball all that much. So there's a good chance that the Rams kind of get the lead and then shut it down and run the ball with their trio in the backfield. So in this choice of 2 players, I would take Robbie Anderson. I think he's a good start today. Thank you, Darren, for the question. And please, any more of you, if you have any more lineup questions, we'll put up the little banner here. The live chat is open. Ask your lineup questions. We'll get to as many as we can throughout the rest of the show. We'll continue with our starts and sits. And if anybody else has any more questions, we'll hit them as we go or hit them after the end. Number 4 on the wide receiver starts is Darius Slayton for the Giants. Somebody has to play well for New York, and they're playing the Cowboys. They've given up the 2nd most fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. 4 100-plus yard receivers this year, and 5 receivers to score 17 or more fantasy points. Slayton has seen 6 or more targets each game, but he has done little since the big Week 1 game he had against Pittsburgh. This is obviously when you're playing Dallas, you start, well, I don't know. That might not be the right phrase to use with the Giants. I was going to say you start everybody, but I don't know that that's necessarily the case. But Slayton, I think, is their top guy this week. Big play player, and Dallas has certainly allowed the big plays. So I've got Slayton on the start list. Number 5, Keenan Allen at the Saints. Saints actually allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. However, the sheer volume from Justin Herbert, Allen has been peppered with targets, 41 targets in the 3 games that Justin Herbert has started, 31 in the last 2. You got no Austin Eckler, so all the more points to Keenan Allen. I think he is a good start this week and likely a good start the rest of the season at this point, the way things are going there. The top sit this week is Robert Woods playing at Washington. Washington allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. They have allowed only 1 receiver this year to top 70 yards, and they are giving up the 4th fewest passing yards in the league. The Rams' pass game has kind of been feast or famine, but Woods, over the last 3 games, has only averaged 41 yards receiving. I think this is a game where Los Angeles, again, leans on the run. Also interesting, Los Angeles has had a lot of trips to the East Coast at this point, so that certainly doesn't help their prospects either. But I do think they certainly have enough to beat Washington today, and that likely will mean playing with the lead and running the ball, which is what they want to do. So I have Robert Woods as the top sit. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, Jamison Crowder for the Jets, playing the Cardinals, who are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. Crowder has been 23 targets in 2 games played, over 100 yards in both, but no Sam Darnold today. Joe Flacco starting. And, you know, I hate to say it, but they're the Jets. Sorry, Jets fans. Number 3 is the top star from last week, Odell Beckham Jr. I think this is a tough game for Cleveland all around. The Colts giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. They've only allowed 60 or more yards to receivers twice this year, and they are allowing the fewest passing yards in the league. Last year, obviously, he was the WR1, 38.4 PPR fantasy points. Just a tough spot, I think, overall. And we know that Beckham has been up and down. Had a great opportunity last week against the Cowboys, but this team is not the Cowboys they're playing. Like I said, the Colts are a little banged up on defense, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I have Odell on the sit list this week. Number 4 is A.J. Green. Just a struggle for Green this year to find his way in the Zach Taylor offense. The Ravens allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. It just has not clicked with Joe Burrow, and I heard an interesting quote this week from Burrow and saying that Zach Taylor has been very good in calling the plays that Burrow likes. And to me, that says a lot because we've seen T. Higgins kind of supplant A.J. Green in that offense in terms of targets. And so if Burrow is more comfortable throwing the ball to Boyd and Higgins, and those are the plays that Taylor's dialing up, then that kind of tells you where they're at. And we've seen Green struggle. So I don't know if waiting for his breakout is necessarily going to be there. So I've got Green on the sit list. Number 5, Brandon Cooks. Cooks has just been a disappearing act this year. 3 targets, no catches last week versus Minnesota, one of the teams that's allowed a lot of passing. He's only had 1 game over 25 yards. I've got Cooks as a sit this week. We got about 15 minutes to game time. Let's get you another little notification here up there. If you've got any more lineup questions for today, please feel free to ask away. We've got a couple more start-sit lists to go through before the games start, and we'll take you right up to game time as usual. The running back spot. Oh, this is going to be controversial, so let's get ready for this one. Starting with the top start. Nothing controversial about this. It's James Robinson. Robinson having a great year. Houston allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the running back spot. They have given up 300-plus rushers this year, and they allowed 3 rushing touchdowns last week against the Vikings. They are giving up the most rushing yards in the league. Robinson over 100 scrimmage yards in each of the last 3 games, and he's averaged 22.27 fantasy points in those games. I think Robinson is a great start this week. I think that he is kind of game script safe, whether or not they are running it a lot or throwing it a lot. He's also seeing targets. Just a surprise guy who really wasn't on the radar at draft time, and we see those every year, and James Robinson is having a great year, so I've got him as the top start this week. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, another guy, Mike Davis, who I really liked as a fill-in for Christian McCaffrey based on what he's done in past years. They're playing the Falcons today. They are allowing the 11th most fantasy points to the running back spot. They gave up. Here's the interesting part. The Falcons gave up 13 receptions to running back last week with the Green Bay game. And Davis has filled that slot nicely that McCaffrey left open. He has had 22.60 fantasy points in the last 2 games without McCaffrey, and he's had 13 catches in those 2 games So again, I think this is an opportunity where either running the ball or catching it out of the backfield, Mike Davis is going to give you production, and I've got him as the number 2 start. Todd Gurley, number 3 in the same game. Carolina giving up the second most fantasy points to the running back spot. They've given up 25 or more fantasy points to 3 running backs this year. Last year, Gurley against Carolina had 97 yards and 2 touchdowns last week he had. So I've got him as the number 3 start this week. And number 4, I've got Josh Jacobs against Kansas City. Kansas City, number 17 to the running back, so just in the bottom half. Jacobs, the last 2 games, a little bit slow. He's averaged 9.8 fantasy points. But last week, Damian Harris had a nice game against the Chiefs, 100 yards rushing. They've allowed the fifth most rushing yards in the league. So I got Josh Jacobs today. A little bit of a concern if they fall behind that he might not get as much work. And I'm actually starting James Robinson over Josh Jacobs in one of my leagues today, even though I've got them both on the start list. So interesting spot there. Number 5, James Conner from the Steelers, coming off a week off. The Steelers actually giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to the running back spot, but I think this is still a good week for Conner. I'm sorry, the Eagles giving up the 13th fewest. I know what I'm talking about a little bit. They've had 2 running backs over 20 fantasy points this year. For Conner, it's been 2 straight 100-yard rushing games. I think this is a good week for the Steelers. And here we go. The top sit that I have this week is Kareem Hunt. Now, I have seen a whole lot of differing opinions this week about Kareem Hunt. And a lot of people are just assuming that with Nick Chubb out, it's going to be Hunt's backfield to himself. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Now, last week, Dearness Johnson came in with 13 carries, 95 yards. Hunt has had a lingering groin injury, although he was not limited in the Friday practice. He was a full participant, which bodes well. However, Johnson's production last week, I think, warrants him getting some time. And if they still at all are trying to protect Hunt, that means a split this week in touches. Not only a split, but a split against the Indianapolis Colts, who are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the running back spot, and they are allowing the 4th fewest rushing yards in the league. Now, obviously, Hunt will have a little bit more involvement in the passing game there as well, and he has had 3 touchdowns in the last 3 games. I think Kareem Hunt going forward is definitely extremely valuable without Nick Chubb, but I am very cautious about this game. And this is one of those where I'm probably going to either say this was a really nice pick here or this was incredibly bad on my part. And Hunt, listen, you're probably starting him. I don't know how you get away from him unless you have a roster that has a lot of depth at the running back spot. It's tough to sit him here. So I guess what I'm saying here is beware with this start. I really feel like this is one to look at with caution. And if you got comments on that Kareem Hunt, please, if you're watching this on replay, leave your comments below. Feel free, good or bad. I have no problem owning it if I'm wrong on these. If you're in the chat, if you have any thoughts on Kareem Hunt and what he might do today, please give us a chat and get in the conversation. Taking a look at the rest of the top 5. Number 2 is Myles Gaskin for the Dolphins, playing the 49ers. San Francisco allowing the fewest fantasy points to the running back spot. They have allowed no rusher over 65 yards this year. Gaskin certainly leads the backfield there, but this is a tough spot against the 49ers. 3, Darrell Henderson. Washington giving up the 10th fewest rushing yards. It's a 3-person backfield there now with Cam Akers back active this week. Not a great spot anymore for Henderson. He got you a couple of nice weeks off the waiver wire, but now you're talking making guesses on who to play in that backfield. Number 4 would have been Phillip Lindsay, but that game has been postponed. The Denver-New England game is not being played this week anymore, so that does give Lindsay another week to get a little bit more healthy. He was going to be active for this game, I believe, but nothing to worry about there. And number 5 is Jeff Wilson for the 49ers against the Dolphins. This is more about the return of Raheem Mostert. If Mostert is in today, then Jeff Wilson is out of your lineup. And at the tight end spot, the top start is Hunter Henry playing against the Saints, who are giving up the second most fantasy points to the tight end spot. 5 touchdowns allowed to tight ends this year. Henry has averaged over 6 targets, but has not found the end zone yet, and I think that changes this weekend. This is the Monday night game. I expect Hunter Henry to have a big game for the Chargers. The rest of the top 5, number 2, Mo Alley Cox having a nice year for the Colts, playing the Browns. Cleveland is allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the tight end spot. They have allowed 3 tight ends 14 or more fantasy points this year and have given up 4 touchdowns to that position. Mo Alley Cox has had a touchdown each of the last 2 weeks. We know how Phillip Rivers likes to use his tight end, so I've got Mo Alley Cox on the start list this week. Tyler Higbee at number 3 for the Rams. Washington allowing the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end spot. They have allowed 2 tight ends 20 or more fantasy points this year, and Mark Andrews had 2 touchdowns last week against them. Higbee has been a little bit all or nothing, but I think you still believe in him at this point. Evan Ingram. Again, anytime I start Evan Ingram, it's like, oh, God, I got to start Evan Ingram. That's kind of just, I don't know. That's the way I feel about it. But it's a good matchup against the Cowboys. They're allowing the 7th most fantasy points to the tight end spot. Obviously, the Giants still a little banged up. Targets for Ingram. Week 1, 2019 versus Dallas, Evan Ingram had 11 catches for 116 yards. That was last year, and a touchdown, 28.6 fantasy points. So perhaps he repeats that performance against the Cowboys this time. And number 5 start is Zach Ertz. I feel like at this point, I'll just keep putting Zach Ertz on this list until he actually has a good game. I don't know who else, who else you count on for Philadelphia with as many injuries as they've had. Zach Ertz has to hit at some point, so I guess that's just playing the odds. The top sit is Mike Gesicki at the 49ers, who are allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the tight end spot. Ertz was held to 9 yards last week, kind of counteracting my point that I just made. But anyway, Gesicki, 3 targets, 1 catch each of the last 2 weeks. Did have a touchdown in week 3, but it's been a little bit disappointing. I've got him as a sit. And the rest of the top 5, Kyle Rudolph at number 2 against the Seahawks. They're allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the tight end spot. They have not allowed a touchdown to a tight end, and Rudolph has averaged just 2 targets this year. Logan Thomas just has not gotten it going. We will see what happens now with Kyle Allen, but he had just 1 catch for 8 yards last week. Number 4, Jimmy Graham was in the Thursday night game, and Graham had a decent game, 12.30 fantasy points, had a touchdown. So decent production return from Jimmy Graham, even though I had him on the sit list. And number 5 from the Jets, Chris Herndon, just 5 catches in the last 3 games. And Chris Herndon has earned a spot on that sit list. All right, we got just a few minutes before game time. Take you right up to start of the 1 p.m. games, as always, here on the TFF Live Sunday Pregame Show. So let's get you a couple promos to close out our show. Here we go. Every week on our YouTube channel, it's the TFF Live Sunday Pregame Show. We're on from 12 noon to 1 p.m., getting you ready for your fantasy matchups. And here's where you can find us, the Fantasy Follow. It's a brand new YouTube channel this year. If you like our videos, if you're watching on replay, or if you're with us live, give us a thumbs up and a share. Please comment. Thank you for being in the chat. And we have a goal this year of getting to 100 new subscribers by week 7. So if you're with us, please go ahead and click that subscribe button and help us reach our goal. You can find us on Twitter at The Fantasy Follow, and that's fantasy spelled FNTSY. Don't forget, on Twitter, you can submit your lineup questions during the week using the hashtag AskTFFLive, and we will answer your questions on the air. You can find us on Facebook /The Fantasy Follow, and our website, thefantasyfollow.com. Glad to have you with us again for another show. That's it for TFF Live. We'll get you ready for the games. It's almost game time. As always, good luck in fantasy. We'll see you next week.